January 15th, 1947, Los Angeles. The morning calm in a residential neighborhood is shattered by a ghastly discovery. A young mother pushing a stroller along South Norton Avenue notices something pale in the grass of a vacant lot. At first glance, she thinks it's a discarded store mannequin, a prank or trash left on the curb. But as she draws closer, the awful truth comes into focus. It is the corpse of a woman, brutally mutilated and bizarrely posed. The body has been severed in half at the waist and arranged with arms raised above the head and legs spread apart, as if in some twisted display. There is not a drop of blood at the scene. The skin is bloodless and marble white, suggesting the victim was killed elsewhere and her body drained and washed clean. The woman's face is horrifically slashed from the corners of her mouth to her ears, creating a grotesque Glasgow smile grin. Deep cuts crisscross her thighs and breasts, with entire chunks of flesh removed. The lower half of her body has been placed a foot away from the upper half, and her intestines have been tucked neatly underneath her buttocks. It is a scene of almost unspeakable savagery, the kind of crime that etches itself into the city's collective memory. Stunned and terrified, the mother grabs her child and rushes to call the police. Within minutes, the vacant lot in the Leimert Park area swarms with Los Angeles Police Department officers. And just as quickly, with newspapermen hungry for a sensational story, detectives carefully examine the macabre tableau. They find discarded items nearby: a cement sack watery with blood, a single heel print in the earth, and tire tracks on the dirt shoulder of the road. These faint clues hint that the killer might have transported the body and carefully arranged it in the pre-dawn hours. Photographers snap pictures as investigators try to shield the mutilated remains from prying eyes. But it's too late. The horrors of this crime scene will soon be splashed across headlines, and the mysterious victim will posthumously become one of the most infamous names in crime history. Who is this poor woman savaged so cruelly? Detectives have no immediate clues to her identity. Her fingerprints, they hope, will tell them more. The body is transported to the coroner's office, and fingerprints are taken and sent off urgently. Incredibly, within hours, the FBI confirms a match. The victim is 22-year-old Elizabeth Short. Just a few years earlier, Short's fingerprints had been collected for an unrelated reason. She'd been caught drinking underage in Santa Barbara, and the FBI's National Fingerprint Database preserved that record. Now those prints put a name to the nightmare in the lot. When the press gets wind of her identity, they seize upon a moniker that will stick in the public imagination: the Black Dahlia. It's a nickname reportedly inspired by Short's rumored love of chic black clothing and perhaps a dark twist on the film The Blue Dahlia, a crime thriller that had been in theaters the year before. In death, Elizabeth Short is transformed into the Black Dahlia, a name as haunting as the crime itself. But who was Elizabeth Short before she became an unwitting symbol of Hollywood's dark side? To her family back in Massachusetts, she was just Beth. Born July 29, 1924, in Medford, Massachusetts, Elizabeth was one of 5 daughters in the Short family. Her early life was marked by hardship. When she was only 6, her father disappeared. His car was found near a bridge, and everyone assumed he had committed suicide in the chaos of the Great Depression. Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe, was left to raise the children alone. The loss lingered. Only years later did they learn that Elizabeth's father had faked his death and run off to California to start a new life, a betrayal that deeply affected the family. As a teenager, Elizabeth struggled with health issues, bronchitis and severe asthma, leading her doctors to suggest she spend winters in a milder climate. Starting at age 16, she began spending winters in Florida, trading New England's icy air for Miami's gentle warmth. These seasonal escapes gave her a taste of independence and life beyond her small hometown. By the early 1940s, she was a young woman hungry for something more, an adventure, maybe even a chance at fame. She dropped out of high school and bounced between relatives' homes, but she dreamed of bigger things. In 1942, an unexpected letter arrived for her mother. It was from Elizabeth's long-lost father, apologizing and revealing he was alive in California. 18-year-old Elizabeth seized the chance for a reunion. She moved across the country to Vallejo, California, to live with her estranged father and perhaps start fresh on the West Coast. But the reunion was rocky. Father and daughter did not get along. By early 1943, arguments drove Elizabeth out of his house. Stranded in California but determined, she found odd jobs and lodged with friends. For a while, she worked at Camp Cook, now Vandenberg Air Force Base, and briefly lived near Lompoc. There, she dated a young Army Air Force sergeant, but that too ended badly amid allegations of abuse. Elizabeth headed south to Santa Barbara, where her adventurous spirit got her in trouble. In September 1943, she was arrested for underage drinking at a local bar. The police, perhaps feeling sorry for the pretty 19-year-old far from home, decided not to press serious charges. Instead, they sent her back to Massachusetts. Elizabeth, however, was not ready to stay put in New England. She spent the next couple of years moving between Massachusetts, Florida, and occasionally California. During World War II, she fell in love with a dashing Army Air Force major named Gordon, whom she met in Florida. He went overseas, and according to letters Elizabeth showed friends, he even proposed marriage while recovering from a war injury. She said yes and waited for him to return so they could start a life together. But fate dealt Elizabeth another cruel hand. Major Gordon died in a plane crash in August 1945, just days before the end of the war. The war ended, but so did Elizabeth's hopes of marriage. At only 21, she had already tasted a full measure of tragedy. Perhaps seeking to escape her grief or simply to chase the Hollywood dream, Elizabeth returned to California in July 1946. She headed for Los Angeles, a city glittering with post-war optimism, opportunity, and the allure of movie stardom. She had a friend there, a former Air Force lieutenant she'd met in Florida, and for a time she stayed in the Long Beach area with him. In the following months, Elizabeth floated around Southern California. She worked as a waitress and occasionally lived with friends or acquaintances in Hollywood, including renting a room behind a nightclub on Hollywood Boulevard. Those who met her described her as an aspiring actress. Though she had no film credits, she talked about wanting to be in the movies. With her jet black hair, porcelain skin, and soft blue eyes, she certainly looked the part of a starlet. She earned just enough to get by, often staying with roommates to save money. By all accounts, Elizabeth was gentle and sweet, but also somewhat enigmatic. A young woman adrift in a big city, attracted to its glamour, yet vulnerable to its dangers. As 1946 turned into 1947, Elizabeth Short's life was a patchwork of temporary addresses and casual acquaintances. In early January, she found herself in San Diego, staying with a girlfriend and trying to plan her next move. She'd been out of work and had little money. At a local diner, she struck up a conversation with a 25-year-old traveling salesman named Robert "Red" Manley. Red was handsome and well-dressed, and though married, he was taken by Elizabeth's charm. The two spent a few days socializing in San Diego. On January 8, 1947, Red offered to drive Elizabeth back to Los Angeles. She accepted. The next day, January 9th, they drove to LA together, arriving in the afternoon. Red later told police that Elizabeth had mentioned meeting her sister at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles that evening. Around 6:30 p.m., Red Manley dropped Elizabeth off at the Biltmore's grand lobby. Unbeknownst to him, that would make him the last confirmed person to see her alive. Elizabeth lingered in the Biltmore's ornate lobby, a lone figure in a stylish black suit. Hotel staff would recall her that night. She paced, made phone calls from the lobby payphone, and looked anxious when the person she was trying to meet didn't show up. Witnesses said she eventually walked out of the Biltmore sometime after 10 p.m. Perhaps she headed a few blocks down to the Crown Grill cocktail lounge, where one or two unverified sightings placed her. After that, Elizabeth Short vanished into the Los Angeles night. For the next 6 days, her whereabouts were a mystery. Friends and acquaintances didn't know where she was. She had no permanent home to return to, and it appears she drifted through the city's underbelly, maybe staying with someone she met or moving from bar to bar. One intriguing account would surface later. A traffic officer, Myrtle McBride, claimed that on the night of January 14th, mere hours before Elizabeth's body was found, she encountered a young woman she believed was Elizabeth Short. The woman was alone outside a downtown bar, sobbing in terror, and told Officer McBride that someone had threatened to kill her. McBride helped the distraught girl retrieve her purse from the bar and watched as a suspicious man slipped away. Shortly after, McBride saw the same dark-haired woman leave the bar with two men and another woman. When the officer inquired if she was okay, the young woman managed a weak smile and said she was fine. By the next morning, that woman, if it was indeed Elizabeth, was dead. This chilling anecdote, though not officially confirmed, paints an image of Elizabeth's final hours, frightened, in danger, and tragically unable to escape what was coming. Now, with Elizabeth's butchered body found in that empty lot on January 15th, the police faced a daunting task. The Los Angeles County coroner, Dr. Frederick Newbar, performed the autopsy on January 16th. The examination revealed the full extent of depravity. Elizabeth had been bound and beaten. There were ligature marks on her wrists, ankles, and neck, suggesting she'd been tied up and possibly tortured. The cuts on her mouth that carved her face into a ghastly smile had been made while she was still alive. She bled from those wounds. The official cause of death was determined to be hemorrhaging from the facial lacerations and shock from a concussion due to blows on the head. In other words, the killer beat her viciously and cut her, and she likely died from that trauma. The bisection of her body was done with surgical precision. The cut through her waist was exact, slicing between vertebrae in a manner taught in medical schools. Crucially, the lack of bruising along the incision indicated this dismemberment occurred after death, a post-mortem mutilation. The killer had also washed the body clean. All of this suggested a perpetrator who was calculating and skilled, perhaps someone with a medical or anatomical background. It was as if the murderer wanted to showcase his gruesome handiwork. With identity confirmed and autopsy complete, the LAPD's next step was to notify Elizabeth's family. In Boston, Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe Short, received an unexpected call. It was not from the police, but from a reporter at William Randolph Hearst's Los Angeles Examiner. Desperate for an exclusive story, the reporter lied to the grieving mother, telling Phoebe that her daughter had just won a beauty contest in Los Angeles. Overjoyed, Phoebe gave the reporter all sorts of details about Elizabeth's life, her upbringing, her hopes, everything, only to have the reporter then coldly reveal that, in fact, Elizabeth had been murdered. It was a cruel journalistic trick, and it set the tone for the frenzied media coverage that was about to erupt. Indeed, once the press had a whiff of the story, the Black Dahlia murder became an immediate media sensation. The combination of grisly violence, a victim with a hint of Hollywood allure, and an unsolved mystery was irresistible to the tabloids. Reporters descended on Los Angeles, turning the crime into a morbid public spectacle. For weeks on end, headlines about the Black Dahlia dominated newspapers, often crowding out even major national news. The Los Angeles papers ran story after story. In fact, one paper had some mention of the case on its front page for 31 consecutive days. The public, both horrified and fascinated, devoured every detail. Many of those details, however, were pure speculation or outright fabrications. In the absence of an immediate suspect, the press filled the void with rumors. They portrayed Elizabeth Short as an adventurer, a promiscuous femme fatale, a mystery woman. Some papers alleged she had a string of lovers and lived a double life. Others insinuated she might have been a sex worker or a lesbian. Sensational angles that titillated readers but deeply upset her family. The LAPD, for its part, quietly debunked many of these claims. A 1949 grand jury later confirmed there was no evidence Elizabeth was ever a prostitute. But in 1947, the truth hardly mattered to the tabloids. They even printed false reports that the Black Dahlia was tortured for hours before death, a claim the police knew was incorrect, but allowed to spread so that the real cause of death, the blows to the head and face, would remain known only to the killer. The media circus was well underway. It got to the point where the case gathered so much public attention and pressure that the LAPD was in a frenzy to catch the killer, or any killer, to quell the storm. Behind the scenes, detectives were frantically chasing down leads. The investigation into Elizabeth Short's life and associates began immediately. Who had last seen her? Who were her friends, enemies, admirers? The list of potential suspects ballooned rapidly as police interviewed everyone who had even a passing acquaintance with Elizabeth. In the first weeks, over 150 individuals were interrogated as potential suspects. Hundreds of tips poured in. At one point, 750 investigators, including LAPD officers, sheriff's deputies, and state patrol troopers, were working the case. An astonishing mobilization reflecting how desperate the authorities were to solve this crime. They scoured crime scenes across the city, storm drains, abandoned buildings, all along the Los Angeles River. Anywhere someone might have tried to dispose of bloody clothes or the murder weapon, but these searches turned up nothing useful. The killer had been careful, leaving scant physical evidence behind. Naturally, police focus first fell on the men who had interacted with Elizabeth in her final days. Robert "Red" Manley, the man who dropped her at the Biltmore Hotel, was brought in for questioning. Red was understandably shaken. He had genuinely liked Elizabeth and was one of the last people to see her alive. He cooperated fully, even submitting to multiple polygraph lie detector tests. Red passed the polygraphs and provided an alibi for the time of the murder, convincing detectives that he had no role in the killing. He was released and eventually cleared of suspicion. The spotlight then moved to Mark Hansen, a local nightclub and theater owner who knew Elizabeth. In fact, Elizabeth had crashed at Mark Hansen's home for a time in late 1946, along with some other friends. Hansen was older and affluent. Some say he had taken a paternal liking to Elizabeth, while others suggest he had romantic intentions toward her. Importantly, when the police sifted through the strange package the killer mailed to the Examiner, they found an address book embossed with the name Mark Hansen on the cover. It turned out this was Hansen's personal address book, which he had given to Elizabeth to use. She'd been carrying it with her. The fact that it showed up in the killer's mailing of Elizabeth's belongings immediately made Mark Hansen a person of interest. Hansen was questioned extensively. He admitted that yes, Elizabeth had stayed at his house and used that address book. A friend of Elizabeth's, Ann Toth, told police that Hansen had made unwanted advances toward Elizabeth and that she had rebuffed him. Was Hansen a spurned suitor who flew into a rage? It was a theory. However, Hansen vehemently denied any involvement, and nothing directly tied him to the murder. He also had an alibi for the likely time of Elizabeth's death. In the end, despite the initial suspicion, no hard evidence could be pinned on Mark Hansen, and he was eventually cleared as well. Still, he remained under a cloud of suspicion in the public eye for years, simply because his name was literally attached to some of her last possessions. As the investigation widened, dozens of other suspects bubbled up. Old boyfriends, acquaintances from Boston or Florida, anyone whose name appeared in Elizabeth's address book or letters, all were tracked down. One man, a soldier named Joseph Dumais, actually confessed to the murder while drunk, but he was quickly found to have been on his army base in New Jersey at the time of the killing. His confession was false, one of many wild goose chases. In fact, false confessions became a major problem in the Dahlia case. The notoriety of the crime lured all manner of attention seekers and disturbed individuals. Over the weeks and months following the murder, police received countless confessions from people claiming to be the killer. At first, each had to be taken seriously, interrogated and checked. But none of the confessors knew details that hadn't been publicized, and their stories often didn't match the evidence. Some were mentally ill, others just wanted 15 minutes of fame in a famous case. After a while, the LAPD began to dismiss these confessions unless the person could provide some solid corroboration. A few of the more persistent false confessors were even charged with obstruction of justice, as they were wasting police resources. By one estimate, dozens of people, perhaps as many as 50 or more over the years, falsely confessed to killing the Black Dahlia. Not one of them could be the real killer, who remained eerily silent except for his cryptic messages to the newspapers. Indeed, the true killer did communicate, but on his own twisted terms. In an astonishing move that seemed torn from the pages of a pulp crime novel, someone claiming to be Elizabeth Short's murderer began sending taunting letters and packages to the press. It started just a few days after the murder hit the news. On January 21, 1947, an editor at the Examiner received a mysterious phone call. The voice on the line congratulated the newspaper on its coverage of the case and then made a chilling promise: expect some souvenirs of Beth Short in the mail. The caller was true to his word. On January 24th, a manila envelope addressed to the Examiner and other LA papers was discovered by postal officials. The address was lettered using cut and pasted clippings from newspaper print, a popular ransom note style of the day. Across the face of the envelope, in bold letters also cut from newsprint, were the words, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." Inside, investigators found a collection of personal items unmistakably linked to Elizabeth Short: her birth certificate, some photographs of her, business cards, scraps of paper with names on them, and that little black address book embossed with Mark Hansen's name. It was an audacious gesture by the killer, as if he were offering up proof that he held the secrets of Elizabeth's life and death in his hands. Every item in the packet had been meticulously cleaned with gasoline, just like Elizabeth's body had been, to remove any fingerprints. Still, forensics experts managed to lift a few partial prints from the envelope's surfaces. There was a brief flurry of excitement. Could these be the killer's fingerprints at last? The prints were rushed to the FBI, but once again, the phantom killer slipped away. The prints were too damaged, likely by the gasoline or handling, and could not be properly analyzed. Yet the package itself spoke volumes. It had to have come directly from the murderer. No one else would have had those personal effects, and certainly no one else would go to such lengths to sanitize them. The police now knew the killer was watching the press coverage intimately and playing a cat-and-mouse game with authorities. The mailings didn't stop there. On January 26th, another letter arrived at the Examiner, this one handwritten. In a tone alternating between mocking and self-satisfied, the writer identified himself as the Black Dahlia Avenger. He claimed he would turn himself in to police on the morning of January 29th at a certain location. He even gave a time, 10 a.m., and mocked the police, saying he'd give them a chance to catch him. Los Angeles detectives, unsure if this was real but not willing to ignore it, staked out the rendezvous spot at the appointed day and hour. The press, of course, got wind of this too, and more reporters than cops showed up at the supposed meeting place. But the mysterious Avenger never appeared. Instead, yet another letter made its way to the newspaper, this time cut and pasted from newsprint like the first. "Have changed my mind," it read. "You would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified." The killer was toying with the city, taunting the police with promises and then disappearing in a puff of smoke. Each message from him or her or them, but most assumed it was a male perpetrator, only fueled the media frenzy more. These communiques earned the case even greater notoriety, if that were possible, and they also gave the Black Dahlia an aura of a criminal mastermind story. To the public, it was like something out of a Hollywood thriller, a fiendish murderer taunting the authorities. But behind closed doors, the detectives were growing frustrated and exhausted. Leads continued to dry up. On February 1st, just over 2 weeks after the murder, the Los Angeles Daily News ran a headline lamenting that the investigation had run into a stone wall. By then, despite all the tips and all the manpower, the LAPD had little to show for their efforts. They had a victim with a tragically short life, an unimaginably gruesome death, and a clever killer who left scant evidence. February faded into March. Public interest, while still high, began to be tempered by the grim realization that this crime might not be solved quickly. Then one more strange twist came. March 14th, 1947. On a beach in Venice, not far from Santa Monica, a beach caretaker noticed a pile of men's clothing near the water's edge. Neatly tucked inside one of the shoes was a piece of paper, a note scrawled in pencil. It read, "To whom it may concern, I have waited for the police to capture me for the Black Dahlia killing, but have not. I am too much of a coward to turn myself in, so this is the best way out for me. I couldn't help myself for that. Sorry, Mary." The discovery of this apparent suicide note caused a stir. Could the killer have drowned himself in the ocean, leaving behind his clothes and this note of confession? Police combed the shoreline and the surf, searching for a body, but no body was ever found. The clothes yielded no identification. It was impossible to know if the note was genuine or another morbid prank. Many detectives suspected the latter, just another anonymous person seeking attention by inserting themselves into the Black Dahlia saga. And if the killer did in fact write it, he evidently changed his mind about that too, as the case would go on unsolved for decades to come. By spring of 1947, the initial torrent of clues had slowed to a trickle. The Black Dahlia investigation was becoming a cold case. Detectives Brown and Hansen, who led the case, continued to chase any thread they could. but Los Angeles authorities had to admit they were stumped. The public's frenzy gradually moved on as other news and other crimes took over the headlines. But the Black Dahlia never fully faded from the public eye. Periodically, new tips would emerge, or an enterprising reporter would claim to have cracked the mystery, splashing speculation in the papers again. Each time, it amounted to nothing definitive. The inability of the police to catch such a vicious murderer did not sit well with the community. In 1949, amid a rash of unsolved murders of women in Los Angeles, the Black Dahlia being the most notorious, a Los Angeles County grand jury convened to examine the city's unsolved homicides. The Dahlia case was front and center. Why, the grand jury asked, with all the resources expended, was the killer still at large? Was there corruption, ineptitude, or just a diabolical murderer too smart to be caught? The LAPD bristled at the implication of incompetence, but laid out their efforts. Detective Harry Hansen testified to the grand jury that he strongly believed the perpetrator had medical knowledge. In his words, a medical man, given how precisely Elizabeth's body had been bisected. This echoed one of the leading theories investigators had held from early on. Maybe a surgeon or someone with surgical training was responsible. The grand jury's inquiry didn't single out a culprit, but it did apply pressure for the police to keep working the case. Following the grand jury hearings, detectives went back through Elizabeth's life one more time, tracing her steps in the months before her death, interviewing people she knew in Massachusetts, in Florida, even old acquaintances in Texas and New Orleans. It was a nationwide effort to find anything, any overlooked hint that could crack the case. Nothing conclusive emerged from those 1949 efforts. Frustratingly, the trail was just too cold. A handwriting expert compared George Hoddle's writing to the block letters on some of the Dahlia letters and found a strong similarity. Steve also uncovered reports that 5 different witnesses back in 1947 had mentioned a connection between Elizabeth and a man named George, or specifically George Hoddle, as her possible boyfriend. All these pieces, in Steve Hoddle's eyes, fit together to form a damning picture. By the early 2000s, he went public with his theory in a best-selling book, Black Dahlia Avenger, naming his father as the killer. The LAPD reviewed Steve Hoddle's dossier, but officially they remained unconvinced, or at least non-committal, perhaps because many of the principals, including George Hoddle, were long dead and unable to defend themselves. However, some in law enforcement did acknowledge the power of Steve's circumstantial case. A former Los Angeles District Attorney, Steve Kay, was quoted as saying, "If George Hoddle was still alive, I would have filed murder charges against him," calling Steve Hoddle's evidence very persuasive. In the court of public opinion, George Hoddle has since become one of the most favored suspects. He died a free man, never charged in the Black Dahlia murder, and if indeed he was the killer, he took that secret to his grave. George Hoddle is not the only name that has been floated in this enduring mystery. Over time, many suspects and theories have emerged, each adding a new layer of intrigue. Some investigators have pointed to another doctor, Walter Bailey, a Los Angeles surgeon who lived near the lot where the body was found. Bailey's medical knowledge and proximity seemed suspicious to a Los Angeles Times writer, but no evidence definitively linked him. Another theory veered into high-level conspiracy. Norman Chandler, a publisher of the Los Angeles Times, was accused in one book of being involved in Short's death to cover up an alleged affair resulting in pregnancy. This sensational claim of a power player's cover-up never gained credible traction and is widely doubted, but it shows the extent of speculation. There was even a rumor that famed gangster Bugsy Siegel or some other underworld figure could have been involved, or that Short's killing was somehow mob-related. Again, no evidence, just intrigue. On the fringes, suspects have included everyone from infamous sex killers to outlandish names like folk singer Woody Guthrie, who had no plausible link and was quickly ruled out. At one point, at least 2 different women came forward to accuse their fathers of being the Black Dahlia killer. Most notably, a woman named Janice Knowlton claimed her father, George Knowlton, murdered Short, and even said she witnessed it as a child. Her story, published in a book, was largely discredited as there was no corroboration, and relatives described her as troubled. In recent years, fresh eyes have revisited the Dahlia case with modern investigative techniques. One author, for example, posited that Leslie Dillon, a bellhop and aspiring writer, was the killer, working in cahoots with Mark Hansen and a corrupt LAPD cop, Sergeant Finis Brown, who was one of the Dahlia detectives. This theory, advanced by researcher Pugh Eatwell, suggests Elizabeth was killed because she overheard a scheme involving robbing hotels and the conspirators needed to silence her. Eatwell argues that a cover-up within the police department protected the perpetrators. It's an intriguing narrative mixing crime, corruption, and conspiracy, but like all other theories, it remains unproven. The LAPD has never endorsed any of these later theories. They often point out that many key suspects, Hansen, Dillon, Hodel, Bailey, are long deceased and without new definitive evidence, such as DNA, which is unlikely given the degradation of any 1947 evidence. The true killer's identity may never be confirmed. So why does the Black Dahlia case remain unsolved, despite decades of scrutiny? Part of the reason is the era in which the crime occurred. In 1947, forensic science was rudimentary. There was no DNA analysis, no surveillance cameras, and the concept of preserving a crime scene was in its infancy. In fact, the Black Dahlia crime scene was infamously trampled by reporters and curiosity seekers before police could fully secure it, possibly destroying evidence. The killer's careful efforts to sanitize the victim's body and belongings were devastatingly effective in erasing fingerprints and traces. The investigation also suffered from information overload and misdirection. Too many tips, too many false leads, too many confessions. It was like finding a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was on fire with media frenzy. By the time methods like DNA profiling came into existence, most of the physical evidence in the Dahlia case had been lost or contaminated. All we have are old reports, memories, and some preserved artifacts that are likely too degraded to yield new clues. Furthermore, any witnesses who might have seen something useful, a suspicious car in the neighborhood that morning, or a person with blood-stained clothes, either never came forward or their recollections faded with time. The passage of years turned into decades, and with each decade, the odds of definitively solving the case dwindled. Yet the case lives on in public fascination precisely because it was never solved. It stands as a dark mirror to the sunny image of Los Angeles. This was a city where thousands of young hopefuls like Elizabeth Short flocked to chase dreams, only for some to find nightmares instead. The Black Dahlia's murder exposed an undercurrent of danger and brutality that made people question what evil lurked beneath Hollywood's glamorous surface. For Los Angeles, the case became a sort of ghost story, a reminder of mortality and the monsters that might hide in plain sight. In the years since 1947, Elizabeth Short's story has inspired books, films, and art, cementing her place in pop culture. James Ellroy's novel, The Black Dahlia, and the subsequent movie imagined elaborate backstories for her. Countless true crime TV episodes have revisited the evidence, each promising, perhaps, to finally crack the case. But none ever truly do. At its core, the Black Dahlia remains a human tragedy, a young woman with hopes and struggles, brutally cut down, and a murderer, or murderers, who walked free. The nickname Black Dahlia has a poetic ring, almost making Elizabeth an icon or character, but it's important to remember that behind that moniker was a real person. Friends described Elizabeth as kind, even a bit innocent, not the cynical femme fatale the papers painted her as. She loved movies and hot fudge sundaes. She wrote letters to her mother. She once thought she'd marry and have a happy life. All of that was taken from her by an unknown hand. Decades have passed. The 78th anniversary of the murder has come and gone, and the likelihood of new evidence emerging grows ever slimmer. The Los Angeles Police Department's Black Dahlia files remain open, and occasionally there's talk of retesting some old item for DNA, or a deathbed confession raises eyebrows. But so far, nothing has brought authorities any closer to a prosecution. In a way, the case has transcended ordinary criminal investigation and entered the realm of legend and lore. The FBI's records on the case, the LAPD's transcripts, the grand jury files, they all tell a story that ends with a question mark. Who killed the Black Dahlia and why? Generations of investigators and crime buffs have tried to answer that, but it remains one of the most perplexing and analyzed unanswered questions in American crime history. Each theory, each suspect, provides a possible answer, yet the puzzle is missing that final piece of irrefutable proof. We might never know if it was a jilted lover, a mad surgeon, a random sadist, or someone else entirely who committed the crime. And because we do not know, the Black Dahlia story continues to haunt and intrigue. It's a case that invites us to peer down dimly lit alleys of the past, to dig through archives and old secrets in hopes of grasping the truth. It lingers in our cultural memory as a cautionary tale and a morbid mystery, a symbol of the ultimate cold case. In the end, we are left with the image of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, forever young in her dated 1940s portrait, smiling coyly at the camera in happier times. We remember the stark contrast between that hopeful face and the horrific fate she met. We imagine the Los Angeles of that era, neon lights and palm trees, crooners on the radio, and somewhere in the shadows, a killer carrying out an unfathomable deed. The Black Dahlia murder case endures not only because of its violence, but because it was never given the closure of justice. There is no grave for the truth in this story. It remains an open wound in the history of American crime. As our half-hour journey through this mystery comes to a close, the story remains open-ended. The Black Dahlia's killer was never caught, and likely never will be. The files will gather dust, and the whispers of who might have done it will continue. In a way, the mystery is now a part of Elizabeth Short's legacy, as much as the tragic fact of her death. It's a tale that forces us to wonder about the darkness that can dwell in human hearts, and about the young woman who deserves so much better. Listeners, as you reflect on this story, you might find yourself asking, how could such a heinous crime go unsolved? And what secrets died with Elizabeth Short and her killer? These questions linger in the chilly Los Angeles dawn that still echoes with the memory of the Black Dahlia. Perhaps somewhere out there, the truth still lies hidden, waiting to be unearthed. Until then, Elizabeth Short's case remains a haunting enigma, a reminder that sometimes reality holds mysteries deeper and more chilling than any fiction. The Black Dahlia's shadow looms eternal, inviting us to remember, to speculate, and to keep alive the hope that one day the truth might emerge from the darkness. The Black Dahlia murder of 1947 is, and may forever be, an unsolved crime, a dark tale of Hollywood's underbelly that continues to fascinate and disturb, leaving us with only questions and the enduring, eerie legend of a young woman named Elizabeth Short.